Hi there. I'm Kimberly Smathers with ATN, and I'm so excited to be here today with Jesse Kohler from CTIPP, Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice.
It's a
Did I get
mouthful,
that right?
yeah, but it's a pleasure to be here with you, Kimberly.
Yeah, it's such a delight. I imagine many of our listeners are familiar with CTIPP, but for those who are not, can you kind of give us a high level of what CTIPP is up to?
Yeah, so for those who aren't, CTIPP is a relatively young organization, so definitely still getting the name out there and the word out there. But we are a part of the growing movement nationally to, prevent trauma, foster resilience across our society. Our main focus as a young organization is really around leading federal policy and advocacy efforts and trying to develop a groundswell of support all across the country and equip, mobilize, and support with resources advocates in districts all across the country to reach out to their own elected officials, other key stakeholders, and educate others to help really mobilize the movement and transform society long term.
Yeah, critical work and obviously crossing all sectors, as you've said. I understand you guys have had some wins in 2022. I believe the reauthorization of the home visiting program for maternal child health and early childhood, and also some around FEMA crisis, kind of unlocking funds when bad things happen to kind of get people what they need.
Yeah, so MCV reauthorization. I mean, MCV's been in place longer than CTIPP's been around, so there's a whole home visiting coalition that we were a part of, and it was great to see the reauthorization there. The Post-Disaster Mental Health Response Act, which you referred to, was a bill. So when there's a major disaster, FEMA was authorized to have money for crisis and counseling supports to communities. But when there's an emergency declaration, there's sort of like two different categories. Major disaster is when a state can't have the resources to sort of repair what was necessary. And then an emergency declaration is a different level of authorization. And so we successfully mobilized, and there were some champions in Congress that really got the work done. But it was a bipartisan bill that essentially allowed for that authorization for crisis and counseling supports to be dispatched in emergency declarations as well as major disasters, which was a great win to see.
Yeah, I mean, so critical. That unfortunately, it feels like the frequency of things like that happening are higher than we'd like, and what better time to make sure there's a thoughtful trauma-informed response.
Yeah, so the cascading climate disasters continue to increase, but it's also, terrorist attacks, domestic terrorism, things like that can receive supports as well. And so it was great to see bipartisan support around that and great to see it move through. And then we also had some success on the education side. Which gets into sort of our theory of change of as we grow, what we want to see more and more of happen. But on the ed side, which can get into some of the work that we're now doing in 2023. So, in March, we had an incredible director of government affairs who actually just left. They came to us as a legislative aide, or from being a legislative aide, became our director of government affairs. I had known them from their time on the Hill, and then they're now going back to the Hill as a legislative director. And so we're really proud of
friends in good places.
For them. Right. Not a bad thing. But when they came on in 2 weeks, they had a really good pulse on what was going on in Congress. And they sort of supported us advocating around appropriations, which is the federal spending bill, around $1 billion in education, a little bit oversimplified. About $500 million of that would be for increased school mental health counselors, and about $500 million would be for a new grant program that would incentivize trauma-informed care in schools.
Oh, wonderful. I know that's welcome news to a lot of the teachers we have here and administrators. Yeah, absolutely.
And so that's what we did in March. And then we developed a trauma-informed schools report that is less than an implementation guide, but more than a blog post to send to every congressional office in the Department of Education and other relevant agency staff. Around what we're talking about with trauma-informed schools and why it's so important. And we were able to have a briefing with DOE. Jim Sporletter and Matt Portell were both on that, as well as a student voice and advocate, Peyton Barcel, who's incredibly powerful. And so the three of them and Jen, our director of government affairs, educated, the federal Department of Education. And then the Department of Education, following that briefing, was really engaged. And they invited us back to do a broader briefing to state departments of education, which then Matt Portell took the place of that because they were looking for someone who had successful implementation as a principal. Matt's an incredibly energetic guy.
Yeah.
And so, we thought that that was the right place. But essentially what happened with that first appropriations bill is that between appropes in 2022 and where we are now, there was the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. And so, that's really supposed to deter violence in communities. And there is a pot of money that is for schools. And so what we're trying to do with state departments of education now, and what that webinar was doing, was that there's now $1 billion, $2 billion going out to state departments of education to help support community violence intervention, essentially, maybe a little bit oversimplified there. But now what we're trying to say to state departments of education is, don't put that toward metal detectors. Don't put that toward weapons in school or some of those other constructs. Like, trauma-informed education, trauma-sensitive schools are what is really going to deter violence long-term. And so that's some of the work that we're doing on the education side now, is just trying to take those dollars that have been allocated and get them spent in the best ways possible. Federal Department of Education gave the money and helped to direct the money, but now it's up to state departments of education on how those dollars are going to be spent. And then it'll be up to local education agencies likely to apply. And so there's so many levels that advocacy needs to take place. And that's why we need that groundswell of support and everybody to join the movement.
That makes so much sense. And are you finding that there is a mindset shift to some degree as we emerge from COVID, as we're seeing other unfortunate things, mental health crises among youth? Does it feel like the conversation is different than it used to be?
Yeah, I think that what COVID did, which is so interesting, is that with trauma-informed care, we talk about a shared language and understanding about how stress and adversity impact the human mind, body, and spirit. And there was a universal stressor that, granted, did not impact everybody or every community the same, but there was stress across. And now we're seeing the impacts of that. Look, the prevalence of rates of youth suicide, substance use, homicide, they were sky high before. I mean, they were in unacceptable places prior to COVID. But after COVID, we just have seen them grow more and more exponentially. And so there is more receptivity, and a lot of the successes that trauma-informed models had seen before COVID, and certainly since, has created more receptivity, I think, to the idea that we need to move toward trauma-informed care and healing-centered engagement in our society.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad it feels like there is kind of that additional willingness to think maybe beyond typical ways of what education should look like, and that's broadly and nationally kind of growing.
And look, there's a lot. I mean, we can't ignore the fact that there is a lot of turbulence and there's tumultuous conversations in the school space, right? I mean, like education, there's a lot of advocacy that is not trauma informed. And there's a lot of movement toward not trauma informed, policies and practices in schools for sure. But I do think that, broadly, this idea that we need to be able to better support not just students, but also staff as we see the workforce burnout, that we need just a whole community model to support is really part of a growing movement that is very exciting. And I think that over time, we'll just continue to see that grow and grow. And I think that one of the other key pieces that Matt's able to really touch on, and I know that Ricky Gibbs, Jim Sporleader, a lot of other leaders, what they've seen is that, a big part of the conversation right now is how do we make up the learning loss, right? How do we make up learning loss that students experience? I'll just put out, I don't like the term learning loss. I think that there was different learning and, it's just not what we generally measure. And I recognize that. But trauma-informed schools have been shown, like when the administration and everybody throughout the school environment really prioritizes students' well-being, holistic well-being, that we see the gaps in learning catch up much more quickly and then are sustained long-term. And so I think that there's a huge advocacy opportunity to say, if we want to make up lost learning, if we want to take care of youth suicide, substance use, dropouts, we need to create trauma-informed environments.
Well, and that's where being at conferences like this feels so impactful. We have speakers, including yourself, who are able to kind of make that practical link. Right. So it doesn't sound, up here. I was listening to Dr. Desatel in her keynote, talking a bit about being able to access the learning part of that brain. And if we don't have that sense of felt safety, how can we close a learning loss? if that's what we're going to call it. So it's fascinating, and I'm glad to hear that folks are resonating with that message. If there are folks, that are listening, how can they get involved? Even if they say, gosh, like I just work in this one little school, what can I do? I'm sure the answer is lots. What can folks do?
So I'll say, like, big school, little school, doesn't matter. Like, my vision, my first job was at a Philadelphia public high school. My second job was at a community center in Philadelphia. And my vision while we work nationally is, one student or one parent or one adult that gets a different level of information and is able to mobilize around a different level of support to develop a relationship with one child that needs it, that changes the trajectory of their life. Right. And so, like, the size of a school, the size of whomever it is that we're advocating to is not insignificant, because the vision is that it gets down to that one person, and then you just magnify that, hopefully millions, billions of times over. But you can go to ctipp.org, that's CTIPP.org. It's on the screen there. And we have a community advocacy network that you can join. We have resources in our resource center. We have a 9-part advocacy series that my brilliant colleague Whitney Maris developed, that sort of supports a broader understanding and knowledge about what is advocacy, what is trauma-informed advocacy, who do I advocate to, how do we take care of ourselves through the advocacy process, as well as recognize the stresses of the people that we're advocating toward, as we really try to model the model through our advocacy, because we believe that that's going to lead to transformation. But joining the community advocacy network is huge, and just continuing to educate others, like at the grassroots level, joining board meetings and going to board meetings to speak up on these issues. I mean, that is all so important, right? And we know that there are so many people that support it. I mean, being at this conference has been incredible to see all of the people all over the country that are doing this work. And so making it more known and vocalizing why this is so important at school board meetings, to individual principals, whatever, like, it is all significant.
I'm hearing all those small pieces that form this unapologetic disruption that we've talked about several times at the conference.
Exactly.
Well, what are you hoping for 2023? I know you've got some things in motion. You've shared a little bit about that, but kind of looking out over a year, what are you hoping to see? So
there's one big bill that we're really helping to champion, and it's been through a few Congresses, but it's bipartisan and bicameral in nature. That we have some really good congressional champions on, called the Rise from Trauma Act. And so that would create a new grant program that funds cross-sector community coalitions. So much of Laura Kane's work around community schools resonated, but cross-sector community coalitions to bridge and help to reduce, the prevalence of developmental adversity and trauma, and come up with unique strategies. And then there's an entire section of that also creates grant funding to train educators, hospital workers, frontline providers, which is really exciting. But beyond just individual pieces of legislation, because our world's just in a place where no one piece of legislation is going to completely transform. Rise from Trauma Act is particularly important, is that, this is CTIPP's second year with full-time staff. We were all volunteer before that, and really built a strong foundation on what we're trying to do. And so I just hope that we continue to see exponential growth of our network and mobilization of more conversations happening, more people feeling equipped and comfortable to advocate together for this growing movement. And I think that when we see that, beyond one piece of legislation that I'm particularly excited about, we are able to see those dollars that I talked about for, state departments of education being spent toward trauma-informed schools. We're able to see pieces of legislation really starting to move, and the conversation continues to evolve. So that way, not just in this Congress, but every Congress moving forward, we really see the priority of trauma-informed care and healing-centered engagement. We just launched a campaign called Take on Trauma to really say that this 118th Congress and beyond, trauma is the root cause of so many of the problems that you're trying to fix in silos. And as a society, we need to integrate our response so that way we get the best outcomes possible.
So well said. So well said. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, gosh, this has just been an honor to get a chance to talk with you. Anything else you'd like to share before we close up for today?
Love the work that, so much of this network does. I mean, I still have to learn so much more. I will say that, I got into this role during COVID. When COVID hit, we saw the need and support for CTIPP to expand. So I went from being a volunteer to more full-time. And, this is one of the first times that I've really been in person with such a large group of educators that are implementing this work. And it's just incredible what's going on around the country. And so, it's not just important that I hear that, but it's important that everybody knows what's going on. And so I hope that you get involved. Never hesitate to reach out. We want to support you as you continue to mobilize. And most importantly, we recognize that you need to do the incredible work that you're doing, but don't be afraid to share that with, key stakeholders that can help continue to drive the movement.
Well, what do they say? If you want to go far, go together.
Yep.
So there we go. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you,
Jesse.
Kimberly.
It's been
It was
wonderful.
wonderful. Yeah.
Thanks.